And of course, that starts in Genesis 37. And when you read the commentaries on the Old Testament, you will commonly find the writers expressing the view that we have two real literary masterpieces in the Old Testament. Two blocks of literature, that each one of which seems to have come from a single writer who knew a lot about the story that he was telling and the characters involved, and used a number of sophisticated literary techniques in the course of telling his story. Well, one of those masterpieces is often referred to as the succession narrative, which is in 2 Samuel chapter 9 through 20 and 1 Kings 1 and 2. That's the story about David and Bathsheba and Uriah the Hittite and Joab, his commander in the field, and several other rather important people who are part of that story, including Solomon at the end. We don't know who wrote the succession narrative. Boy, I would give anything to know who that was. That's such a fascinating literature there. But Solomon brings the succession narrative to an end. And he is presented to the reader in glowing terms. The first 11 chapters of the First Kings are all about the reign of Solomon. And one thing that you learn about Solomon is at the beginning of the story is that he is presented to the reader as, well, some have said the ideal wise man in ancient Israel. He is the one who has all the traits that the wisdom tradition of the ancient Near East admired so much. But what is often overlooked is the fact that when you get toward the end of the Solomon story, say in chapters 10 and 11, everything falls apart. And Solomon, who is praised as the wisest of all the men of the ancient Near East, has one extraordinary bit of wisdom to teach us, and that is that however sophisticated one's wisdom may be, you can always lose it. And Solomon did, which is now, I say all of that to refer to the second great literary masterpiece in the Old Testament, which is the Joseph story. And I don't remember where I read this, but somewhere a long time ago I read a writer who suggested that even though Solomon is remembered as the father of the Israelite wisdom tradition, and perhaps you could make a good case for that, the idea that he is the ideal wise man in ancient Israel is questionable. The character who might more deserve that title is Joseph. Joseph, whose story we have in Genesis 37 through 50, has virtues and talents that the wisdom tradition of the ancient Near East greatly admired. A couple of the virtues that he exhibits, first of all, the virtue of self-control. Now, he doesn't have that in chapter 37, where the story starts. He hasn't got enough wisdom yet to control his need to share his dreams with his family, which they don't take too kindly to. But by the time we get to chapter 39, things are really changing in Joseph's character, and he is accumulating more and more wisdom all the time. Emphasized in chapter 39 by the fact that we read there at least 4 or 5 times at various points in that chapter that God was with him. The Lord was with him in this particular set of circumstances. He was with him in this next event that happened, and again in another set of circumstances. And so self-control is a big part of the composite that makes up the picture of an ideal wise man in the ancient Near East. He also has the virtue of sexual integrity, a virtue that this country could use a lot more of, don't you think? But that's exhibited, of course, in the incident with Potiphar's wife. I'm sure everybody knows that story. Then again, he also has the talent to interpret dreams. He has the talent to foresee the future in various forms of divination. One thing that he has in particular that I admire quite a bit is the ability to speak the timely word, what the ancients called the timely word, which is saying the right thing in the right way to the right person at the right time to bring about the right result. And boy, didn't he do that. I mean, when he had this opportunity to interpret the dreams of the Pharaoh, Pharaoh is, he's pretty frustrated at that point. He's got this cadre of wise men guys around him in the court, and they can't make heads or tails of his dream. Joseph is given the chance to interpret the dream for the Pharaoh, and he does. But then he goes on to do more than the Pharaoh asked for. All the Pharaoh wanted him to do was tell him the meaning of these troubling dreams that he had had. Joseph does that, and then adds a little appendix at the end. So, now Pharaoh, in light of all of this, here's what you should do. And outlines for him a food reserve program that is perfectly fits the crisis that Egypt is about to face. After the 7 years of plenty and then the 7 years of famine, Joseph speaks the timely word to the Pharaoh, and does so with great things happening. He becomes the second most powerful person in all of Egypt as a result of that. So, just stop me if you have a question or a comment or something you'd like to share with the rest of us. Otherwise, I'm just liable to go rattling on,
Well, I did have a question, Tony.
Yes, sir.
His ability to interpret dreams. I didn't just, I read the whole thing, and I assumed that was God basically telling him, he was passing on what he had gotten from God in terms of how that dream. I mean, he wasn't getting his crystal ball out and reading tea leaves and reading lines on on your palm. He wasn't just coming up with that. That's what I assumed. Is that the way I should interpret that?
Of course, yeah, that's right.
Okay. It never said that anywhere.
The fact that he could interpret the dreams was understood to mean that he had special access to God's revelation that would tell him what the dream meant.
Yeah, okay.
And
I just never read that in the text anywhere. At least I went back and read it a couple of times, and I didn't see where it,
I don't recall if there's a verse that makes that specific point, but I think the text pretty much applies that.
It's in here. It's in chapter 41, verse 16. Joseph answered Pharaoh, It is not I. God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah.
41:16.
41:16. I see it.
Okay, good.
Thank you.
Don't you think that, Tony, you talk about the wisdom that Joseph had? You just mentioned right time, right people, right moment. And sometimes that's how the God's way works. Sometimes he just do the things, surprise you. Maybe you wonder what happened. You know what I mean? I didn't read this before I come here, but I have heard the story about Joseph. He's a very smart person. But I think that somewhere in the Old Testament, I don't know where, I think it's the king. It says, fear God, beginning of wisdom. That's what
The fear of God, yeah. Yeah, that's a often repeated sentiment in the wisdom literature, yes.
That's the beginning of sometimes we are away from God, and the wisdom stops, maybe.
Yeah.
And in fact, yet, God gave us things to see ahead of time, and learning something from it. That's how God plays a very important part of your life.
And if we would practice that fear of God thing that the wisdom literature loves so much, we are less likely to drift off into the arid deserts where the revelation of God is not quite so obvious. But Joseph, like I say, after chapter 39, he has that fear of God. By the way, fear of God does not mean that he's terrified of God. It means that he has the proper reverential attitude toward God and understands the relationship between himself and God as one of God is the master, the controller, the providential force. Joseph is the servant, the subject of the king. And that should be a model for our relationship to God too, shouldn't it? By the way, about that timely word thing, I've got a quote here that I want to share with you. It comes from a book by Richard Davenport Hines, a British writer who wrote a book called Voyagers of the Titanic. Now, I told my Whosoever Will share last week another quote from the Titanic. This is different, okay? He was writing about one particular lady who was of the British nobility. And he says about her, Lady Dorothy Neville was her name. He says that she had once defined the art of conversation as not only saying the right thing at the right time, but leaving unsaid the wrong thing at the tempting moment. Leaving unsaid the wrong thing at the tempting moment. Probably all of us could dredge up from our memories somewhere a memory that appalls us to this day for having said something that we wish we hadn't said. Like is often said about Simon Peter in the New Testament, that he opened his mouth only to change feet. And that certainly seems to be the case, doesn't it? Well, let's see. I wanted to mention one other thing to you about the Joseph story. A couple of other things. Not only do we have a clear portrait of Joseph, we come away from the Joseph story with the early chapters with a pretty good sense of his character. But another one of the techniques that the writer uses is foreshadowing. And I really like this one. Good writers will give sensitive readers a hint in the story somewhere of something that is to come later on. And we have some of this in chapter 37, the very first chapter of the Joseph story, where Joseph, like we mentioned before, he shares these dreams with the rest of his family. His family doesn't appreciate the import of those dreams at the time. But nevertheless, we see in hindsight later on the important role that dreams play in the Joseph story. Joseph has his dreams. The prisoners in the prison where Joseph has become the supervisor is the trustee supervisor. They have dreams. Then the Pharaoh has dreams. And so if you're having dreams, that's not necessarily a bad thing. But I'm fairly confident that Joseph developed his talent for interpreting dreams despite having never read Freud. What do you think? Well, okay. One other item that you might want to take note of as you study the Joseph story is ironic reversal. And I think this is crucial to our appreciation of the Joseph story. Ironic reversal. And I mean to say by that the writer presents the whole story to us in such a way as to show us how God controls and manipulates human plans in a way that leads to the opposite of human intentions. Take the brothers, for example. They sell him into slavery, don't they? And their plan is to get rid of him and to never have to put up with his obnoxious insensitivity again. And so they sell him into slavery, and they assume that he's just gonna disappear in Egypt, and he's out of their lives, and he's not gonna be a thorn in their lives anymore. But look what happens. God manipulates their plan in such a way as to raise Joseph to an office of power and authority in Egypt, which leads to the salvation of Israel. Here's a quote from the Jewish Study Bible on this point. Listen to this. Talking about that very thing. The malignant intentions of human beings can realize the benign intentions of God. The people Israel, ironically, survived the worldwide famine because Joseph's brothers sold him into slavery. That is so powerful. I feel myself choking up a little bit as I think about that. But don't you agree that that's a very, very good point?
And Joseph says that in chapter 50. You know, you meant this for evil, but God used this for good. You meant this for harm.
Tony, you probably don't realize it, but for those of us in the Foundations of Faith class, we've been talking about this very issue when studying the Jacob story. You know, how Jacob and his mother tricked Isaac and all the implications of that. And what does that mean? And how was God involved? So.
That's a good point too. You called it Jacob deceived his brother Esau twice and aroused fratricidal purposes in the heart of Esau in doing so. By the way, there's some real humor in the story at that point, it seems to me. I think it's chapter 27, verse 42, where Rebekah has found out that Esau is planning to kill Jacob. And she goes to warn Jacob because he is, after all, her favorite son, just as Esau is Isaac's favorite son. And she says to him, your brother Esau is consoling himself by planning to kill you. Well, that just strikes me as humor. You know, there's a lot of humor in the scripture that sometimes goes unrecognized. I remember one other example of that, how Moses gets so frustrated with the Israelites in the wilderness. They won't listen to him, won't obey, won't do what he advises them to do. And then he finds them on the point of rebellion. They're ready to overthrow him and replace him and go back to Egypt. So Moses goes and he prays to the Lord and says, Lord, if I have gained any favor in your sight, if you think well of me at this point in my story, then please kill me at once. I don't remember the exact verse where that is, but that one just makes me howl with laughter. I'll say one more thing about the characteristic of the Joseph story, and this has to do with the writer's stated purposes. I think that you can say about the writer here that he has a historical purpose and a theological purpose. And his historical purpose is to explain how God saved Israel from a famine, led them to live in Egypt in the time of Joseph, and preserved a future for them, which is a good point to remember at the end of Genesis, because when you leave Genesis and go to Exodus, 400 years have passed, kind of silently. And it's good to be aware of that. The theological purpose is that to illustrate the providence of God in Joseph's life, in the guidance of Joseph's life, as he works for the welfare of Joseph's clan and the future of Israel. In fact, I really believe that the providence of God is the leading theological theme in the Joseph story. I think if you had to boil that whole story down to one central theological point, that would be it, the providence of God. God, John Claypool used to say that God's middle name is surprise. And he made a good point there, because God's providence is frequently surprising. You don't, you might read a situation or experience one yourself in which everything seems pointless and hopeless, dreary and headed toward doom, and then something happens. Then something happens. I've had that happen in my life. I bet everybody in here has too. Where you can look back and you can, I didn't see it coming, but in hindsight, I know God was working in doing this to bring about a good result. And that really happens with Joseph, doesn't it? Well, okay. Anybody got a thought or two you want to share with us at this point?
You know, Tony, that I feel the stories. Sometimes God say no to all of us. It's not a bad thing after all. You know that? Sometimes God say no. The story starts from this Joseph story. It's a very sad story to begin with. Very sad story. But yet, how God, each step of the way, bring out His perfectness, the completeness, to let the people see. After all, He's still in control of this world. You know that? That's how that is.
Yeah. Let's expand our faith so that we develop greater insight to help us recognize how God is in control of this world, whereas in our ordinary plain point of view in everyday life, we might lose touch with that.
I'll have to say, Tony, that my faith is really lacking in that area, because it just seems the world is so out of control in many ways. It's hard to see God's plan or God's control
Yeah.
what's going on. or
What's he up
whatever.
to? Yeah, you wonder, don't you? What's he up to
Yes.
with so much craziness in the world today?
That's the only thing that keeps me going, to realize that God controls everything, and otherwise I'd be completely lost.
I know what you mean. I feel that a lot. Anybody else want to share something to that effect?
I think it's hardest when you're in the middle of it, that you look back many times
Yeah.
and see what happens there. I mean, I can't believe that Joseph wasn't completely demoralized when he was in the wagon on the way to Egypt, not knowing what was ahead of him. And it took years before that it came to fruition, but I mean, I know exactly what you're saying. I believe you. I mean, it's when you're in the middle of it, it's hard to see. And I keep using the reference, if I had been in Egypt for 350 years praying to God for release, and it hadn't happened for any of my relatives for the last 17 generations or whatever, I would have given up hope.
I admired how strong Joseph's faith was through it all. I mean, when he got thrown in prison, I mean, he always turned bad into good with his faith. So
There's a real turning point in Joseph in chapter 37. You go from 37 to 39. Even early in 39, he seems to be completely different. His character has congealed somewhat, and the virtues stand out more clearly. He is becoming stronger and stronger and stronger. And I'll tell you, there's another place, I think, in the Joseph story where if anybody had a right to become demoralized, it was Joseph. Remember the two prisoners who come to thrown into prison and where Joseph has become the trustee there. And they have the dreams, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker. And they don't know what the dreams mean, and they're troubled by that. So Joseph offers to interpret the dream for them, and he does. And for the chief cupbearer, he has good news. Within 3 days, the Pharaoh will restore him to his place in at court. For the baker, it's bad news. Within 3 days, Pharaoh is going to have him hanged, and he does. So when those things happen, and Joseph's interpretation of the dream is confirmed, as the chief cupbearer is leaving to go back to court, Joseph says to him, when you get back to court, would you please mention me to Pharaoh, and perhaps draw his attention to my case here, and perhaps something positive can come out of this. And then the next verse goes on to say that the cupbearer went back to court and forgot about Joseph for 2 whole years. It doesn't say 2 years, it says 2 whole years. Like Joseph may have been experiencing frustration growing every day during those 2 years, but he still had the strength to stay with this difficult situation, and he was ready to cope with it when the opportunity came. He suddenly finds himself summoned to court when the chief cupbearer does remember Joseph back in the prison. Pharaoh summons Joseph to court, and you know the rest of the story. That's a very good thing.
I admired his integrity.
Yeah.
And I found the story so much more uplifting when you were here last week or the week before. I mean, the story of Jacob and Esau, I had real trouble with that one. And I was actually reading scripture at the moment about Esau, and I had to stop because I got emotional. I mean, that story was just really grabbed me as unfair. And but this story, I mean, his integrity, his faith, I mean, everything was so uplifting. That's just the way I like this story a lot better than the other story.
Have you ever had the question occur to you when reading Genesis, how does a guy like Jacob become the father of a guy like Joseph?
Yeah. Yeah. Agreed.
But he did.
He did.
He did. And I'm glad he did. By the way, Jacob, there is one of the great Old Testament surveys that was published. It's now in its 4th edition, called People of the Covenant by Flanders, Crapps, and Smith. Those were 3 Baptist professors who published that survey of the Old Testament. First of all, I think in the 70s, the first edition was great, and it got even better through the next several editions. They made a comment in there about Jacob, and I can't quote it. I can't remember it specifically how it went, but it was to the effect that God surprises us by using the most unlikely people to accomplish His purpose. And doesn't He use the most unlikely person is Jacob, isn't he? I mean, his very name means cheater, basically. Supplanter, somebody who, remember how he was born when he comes from the womb. Second, he has his hand gripping around the heel of Esau like he's trying to yank him back into the womb so that he can come out first. And, well, back to another point I wanted to make, though, about Jacob, since you brought him up. Remember, he has to flee from his brother Esau, who's consoling himself with thoughts of fratricide. And he stops at Bethel on the journey north to take up residence with his uncle Laban for the next 20 years. And there he has the dream in which God appears to him. There's another humorous thing about in the Old Testament, I think. The very first thing that God does in the dream, as He reveals Himself to Jacob, remember how Jacob sees the old traditional translation is the ladder. He sees the ladder stretching up to heaven. Actually, what he saw was something like a monumental stairway, like the stairway that leads up to the Capitol building in Washington, D.C., something like that. And the angels of God are going back and forth on that stairway. And there's God up there at the top in heaven, up there in the stairway. And the first thing that God does in the dream, now this might not strike you as funny, to me it's hilarious. The very first thing that God does in that dream is introduce himself to Jacob, because he has every reason to believe Jacob hadn't got a clue who God is. So, I am the Lord God of Abraham, Isaac, and now you, Jacob. So get your act together. And part of that revelation in that dream was the promise that he would stay with Jacob during his stay in Aram, and would bring him back to the promised land eventually. And he comes back, and remember that dramatic story about the two brothers coming together. Jacob, as he arrives back in the land, sends word to Esau that he has come back. And there's a lot of tension in the narrative there, as you don't know how what's going to happen. Jacob sends a messenger to Esau. Esau comes back with the messenger comes back to Jacob and says, well, we have good news and bad news. We found Esau and we delivered your message. That's the good news. The bad news is he's coming out to meet you with 400 armed men. Well, what would you think if your brother was coming out to meet you with 400 armed men? You'd think that he's still got fratricide on his mind, wouldn't you? But isn't that such a tender moment when the two of them finally come face to face? And Esau can't bring himself to do what he has been fantasizing for 20 years he wanted to do, murder his brother. And he just can't do it. And by the way, folks, Janice, I saw you in the choir singing this morning. Was there anybody else in the choir up there this morning? Yeah, okay. Anybody else in the 8:30 service? You were?
Diane was.
You were in the 8:30 service? Well, I think you probably agree with me when I tell everybody else, when you get to the 11 o'clock service, if you're going, you better sit down and fasten your seatbelt. Because George is going to give you one of the best sermons that I have ever heard in my life. And it is powerful. And I think you'll agree with that after you've heard it. So I just give you that word of warning there.
In the Joseph story, there was a couple of, the other things I found a little interesting were, they didn't mention all the brothers, but Reuben, there were a few comments about Reuben and Judah. They were the two I think that were mentioned the most. And how many, we've known a lot of Reubens. I've known a lot of Reubens, I'm sure you have too. 90% of the politicians in this country are Reubens. But, I mean, he's like a chameleon. He sort of changes with the color or whichever way the wind's blowing. But then it sort of comes to a conclusion with Jacob's blessings. And he basically tells him, you're done.
Reuben he seems to be a self-promoter. And, he gets himself on the outs. He takes sexual advantage of a woman on whom he has no valid claim whatsoever. And that really disturbs his father Jacob. And then we find Reuben trying to earn his way back into the good graces of his father Jacob. He's the one who intervenes and saves Joseph's life, remember? He's the one that says, no, don't kill him, let's do something else. Don't do that, don't go to that extreme. I'm like, here come the Ishmaelites, why don't we sell him to them? And at least he saves Joseph's life.
I think he was thrown into a dry well.
Yeah.
We're not throwing him in one in water, he was drowned and
No, it was
threw him in a dry well.
It was a cistern.
Yeah.
And by the way, you mentioned Judah. I think Judah is the third most important person in the Joseph story. I think Joseph, of course, is first, and Jacob is second, even though for much of the story he's kind of a marginal figure. But Judah is too. I don't often recommend that people read Genesis 38 because it is lurid. and depressing. And you find Judah, doing things that you would not want any normal man to do. And getting involved with a prostitute who turns out to be his daughter-in-law disguised as a prostitute. And you come away from chapter 38 with a very bad impression of Judah. But in the end, Judah is the one who, not having yet recognized Joseph as who he is the one who intercedes when Joseph wants to release all the brothers and let them go back to Canaan, but he's going to hold Benjamin there in slavery for the rest of Benjamin's life. Judah is the one who intervenes and begs Joseph for the opportunity to take Benjamin's place. He wants to serve Benjamin's sentence. He wants to be the one to go into slavery. Why? Because he says he can't bear the thought of what the loss of Benjamin would do to his father Jacob.
He had made a personal commitment to his father.
Yeah, and he had. And don't you imagine that personal commitment in Judah, as well as in the other brothers, must have been enhanced over the years. Think about this. You know, they were bent on revenge in chapter 37. They were up to the brim with indignation over the obnoxiousness of this brat brother of theirs, Joseph. And boy, how good that revenge must have felt in chapter 37. Waving bye-bye to Joseph as he's being dragged off in chains and tatters on his way to slavery in Egypt. They didn't stop to think about how they would feel about this next day, next month, next year. They go back home and they present the so-called coat of many colors to Jacob. They stained it with goat's blood. And they let the power of suggestion do its terrible work, and Jacob draws the obvious conclusion: the wild animal has killed Joseph. And that, I think, is probably when they began to realize that they were going to have to live with this fictional conspiracy for who knows how long. They're going to have to endure that silence. They're going to have to engage in a conspiracy of silence and sustain that story until Jacob's dying day. Don't you know that burden became heavier and heavier and heavier?
I'm not sure they realized the importance of the two children that were by Rachel, which I guess Jacob loved from the beginning. And that's who he wanted to marry before Leah came along and substituted. So I don't think the brothers really realized the importance that those two children were toward the end.
Well, they must have caught on somewhere along the way.
Yeah, but I think
because, you know, the coat itself was a symbol of Jacob's favoritism toward Joseph. And don't you find this surprising? You would not expect Jacob to be doing that, given his family heritage, where his father, Isaac, his favorite of the two of them is Esau. And Rebecca, her favorite is Jacob, and you saw how that disaster worked out. You just wouldn't expect him to be playing this favoritism game like he was. But here he is, doing it. Joseph, the firstborn of Rachel, then Benjamin, clearly his two favorites.
No question about that. It looks like from your notes, Genesis covers the beginning of time up to about 1700 BC. And when is it thought that Genesis was written?
Genesis is probably, the standard theory these days is that it's a composite work consisting of the interweaving of mainly three different sources that were first beginning to be put together in about the 10th century, and then over the next couple of centuries put together, so that Genesis becomes in its final form maybe about 8th, 7th century BC.
Oh, okay.
That's the theory.
Oh.
Yeah. But the 1700 thing, is that the chart that you're looking at?
Yeah.
that's, Abraham is considered to be the one who begins biblical history, the Old Testament history per se, and so he's dated around 1700.
And written 1,000 years later?
Well, it's, Genesis maybe assumes final form 1,000 years later, but it was the repository of a lot of different traditions coming together in a complicated way, so the theory holds, that preserved a lot of memories of ancient Israel.
You probably have the same one I have, Moses. Mine has the author as Moses around 1450, 1410 BC, and the wanderings around Sinai, when they were wandering, when the Israelites were.
It's interesting that the Torah, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, has in it only 6 passages that say that Moses wrote anything.
Okay.
And those 6 passages identify in each case what it was that they refer to. And none of them is Genesis as a whole,
Okay.
or the Torah as a whole. One of them is the Song of Moses, for example. That whole question is very complicated, and if you're really interested in it, People of the Covenant, 4th edition.
What was it again?
The title of that Old Testament introduction, People of the Covenant.
People of the Covenant.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, that's one of the best, I think.
Okay.
In fact,
Okay. I'll snap a picture of that.
it's written by Henry Jackson Flanders, who was pastor of First Baptist Church in Waco when I was a Baylor student. And this next guy, Robert Wilson Crapps. How would you like to have a name like that?
I was like his wife.
And David Anthony Smith. The People of the Covenant, this is really one of the best. I really recommend it. I think, Dennis, I better stop here,
Okay,
10:35.
all right.
I mean,
Thank you, Tony.
Yeah, 10:35, 10:40, you know. Well, okay, thank you, Tony. So we have for prayer requests, I can't tell whose handwriting this is, but it says same as last week.
There's an arrow,
Is it referring, oh, is this Vicky? Okay.
Yes, yes.
This is Vicky asking for prayers for the upcoming sale of her house? Is
Well-
that premature for me to say that?
Yeah, but the land has to sell first from the guy that's buying my house, so it's a contingency contract.
Right, he's waiting to see if
Right.
he can sell his house before he can buy your
Yeah,
house.
if he
Okay.
sold his house, but he wants to sell some land.
Okay, so fingers crossed for Vicky.
Yes, lots of prayer.
Continuing.
Buyer's land.
Yes. Any other prayer requests we want to add? I'll just add that Kim brought up last week, and that we all agreed to pray for the issues and ongoing issues related to the shooting in Florida. So,
And that this country can find some way to come together to solve the problem.
yeah. So I'll add that. And if there are no others, let's join together in prayer then. Dear Lord, thank you for this time that we have spent together studying your word. Thank you for bringing us Tony and having him share with us his insight, having share with us his experience and knowledge of Scripture. And during this process, as he has as we have read from your word and exchanged words with each other, thank you for the opportunity to hear your word. Please let us know and always be able to understand that we can always have the hope that you are at work in our lives and in the processes of our lives, even if it's not apparent to us in the moment. We lift up to you our prayers and our concerns for the week. We offer continuing prayers for Vicki Beasley as she continues to work towards the sale of her house in Oklahoma. Please be with her and all those involved in the process, and have it lead to an outcome that is advantageous to everyone. Lord, we continue to express our concern and our hope in some sort of resolution, in some sort of solution to the issue of gun violence in our country. It seems trite to say that we offer prayers for the victims of the shooting because we know that they need to hear more than just words coming out of our mouths. So help us through our prayers, and help them through hearing our prayers to know that it is more than just words, that it will lead to action, to engagement, to discussion, to some sort of way through the problem that we currently have. And as we utter words of prayer, help us to focus on your word, your way, that can help us through this. Help us to know that when we are searching for your word and your way, we can find the ultimate example of your word in your Son, Jesus Christ, who is the Word of God. And it is in his name that we now pray. Amen.